All right, it's about that time. So thank you guys for coming. We're going to be talking about SQL Server attacks today. So last year, I was lucky enough to present here as well, and it was also on SQL Server. I focused a lot on discovering SQL servers, gaining initial entry, doing privilege escalation within the SQL Server layer. I got a lot of feedback from people in the community, and they were really using it more for post-exploitation as kind of a medium for persistence. And so I tried to spend more time in this year's talk really focusing on those items. Let's see if my actual clicker is going to work. The goals will be very briefly to touch on the most common way we're getting access to SQL servers during internal pen tests. We're going to talk about how to identify and try to hide from some of the audit controls that exist on that SQL server layer when you're trying to execute on red team engagements. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about how to execute OS commands through SQL server in different ways, not just relying on XP command shell. This is sweet. We're going to talk about a lot of the cool work that Alexander Leary did. He ported a ton of these power-up SQL functions over to PowerShell Empire. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some tips for the blue team. All right, so just to get us started real quick, this is Alexander. You may have met him in the last WMI session. I'm Scott Sutherland. We both work for NetSpy as network and application pen testers. Like I said, last year I did a talk on PowerUp SQL and SQL Server attacks. And so that slide deck and this slide deck will be out on SlideShare later today. So we should just tweet those out, or you can go just check them out. But let's just get into it with the time we have. So we'll talk about, this is kind of our most common escalation path for SQL Server. I talked to other pen testers, and they seem to share this experience. The general idea is during some pen test, red team, etc., you have some domain user access. You use that access to query the domain controller for SQL servers that are associated with the domain. You then attempt to log in using normal domain user credentials, and for various reasons, you'll be able to log in to quite a few, which were covered in the other talk I did. And then we're just going to do UNC path injection. So we're going to force the SQL server to authenticate to us, and we're going to be able to capture that hash and either relay or crack it. So the attack flow kind of looks like this. Domain user has excessive privilege to log in. They have public role in the SQL server. There are a number of different functions in SQL server that are available to that least privileged public role that they can execute. That's going to force the SQL server to authenticate to the attacker's IP. They're going to crack or relay the passwords, and then they're going to have basically the credentials for the service account running SQL server. And the reason this gets you sysadmin in SQL server is that in every version of SQL server, the service account has sysadmin privileges. No one can tell me why that is. I've talked to people at Microsoft and DBAs. I'd recommend to just take it out of the group, but I'm really afraid what would happen in production. So if any of you guys know the answer to that, I'd be really happy to hear it. One of our guys, Thomas Elling, put together a function for PowerUp SQL that just automates that entire process, which I'll show you a quick demo of. He's our super all-star, you know. You may notice as we go through, this is a Toy Story theme because we're releasing so many functions and toys that we thought it was appropriate. So the general idea here is you're going to import PowerUp SQL however you prefer. We can see we're running as a normal domain user with no special privileges. Domain user. We're going to go ahead and run that function that he created for PowerUp SQL. It's invoke SQL UNC path injection. We're super creative with our naming. We're basically just going to set our capture IP to our local system. So when it goes and tries to authenticate to all the SQL servers, they're going to be trying to authenticate back to us. And we're going to be using on the back end Kevin Robertson's invoke inve, which is basically like responder for PowerShell. It's a completely awesome toolkit, so go check it out. So he gave us permission to use that. So you can see we're already getting hashes. All we had to do is put in our IP running on a domain system. So it works pretty slick. You can then store all the hashes as a variable if you want. It captures the clear text if there's clear text, net NTLM v1 and 2. I'm typing really slow in this demo because it was like 2 in the morning and I had too many jacks, I think. But anyways, you can see there's your net NTLM v2 password hashes. So it's a good way to get a head start kind of in this process. But once you've established sysadmin rights and you want to kind of use SQL Server as a beachhead or a means to kind of execute commands and move laterally through the environment, you kind of want to do so carefully because some DBAs are actually very aware of some of the techniques that attackers are using, and they're auditing for this stuff. And SQL Server really has a robust audit capability. It can be very, very granular. So as an attacker, we want to keep this in mind. The way that the audit configurations are set up is you basically define a server level audit. That maps to server audit specification, which basically means configuration changes on the SQL server, meaning the SQL server application, not the underlying OS. And then for each database on the server, you can audit very specific things. It can get very granular. So quick note, I have a lot of TSQL in here. I did create TSQL templates that are out in the PowerUp SQL templates directory. So everything the commands do, you can just pull down and do manually. Because if I was you, I'd want to do that. So I'm going to show some quick examples, but I'm going to gloss over a lot of the code. So just know that it's out there. You can go check it out. So in this example I created, I'm an attacker coming in. I found a Derbycon audit set up. I then went and looked at the server audits, and I can see that there's some audit change monitoring going on in any server operations group, so that's all those config changes. We can see it's enabled. And then when you get to the database level, you can get really granular. So in this case, I'm auditing for the blue team's auditing for very, very specific things. We can see it's also enabled. So as an attacker, what are you going to do? Some people just say, let's remove it. Generally speaking, not OPSEC safe. Some clients will just fire you for doing stuff like that. So from a professional perspective, I don't think it's a great idea. You could disable them, which is less impactful, but there's some negative effects there from a detection perspective. So what we try to do is we just try to get a lay of the landscape, understand what they're auditing and what they're not, and just choose techniques that they're not auditing. Super simple. So it's a funnel approach, right? For those people who are a little bit more adventurous and do want to disable or remove audit controls, there's some sample code there for you guys. But just note, if you do go in and disable it, if they do have that audit change group, they are going to know that you're changing any of the audit control configurations, because that's essentially what that does. So the blue team's going to be on your ass really quick. So just be aware they'll be watching. There's a couple PowerUp SQL functions there. There'll be a summary slide at the end, but just know you can look at both the database and the server configurations. So here's where we're going to spend most of our time, talking about executing commands through SQL Server. For those of you who didn't see last year's talk, this is just a reminder. When you're executing OS commands through SQL Server, you're not doing it as your SQL user, and very often you're not even doing it as your Windows user if you happen to log in with Windows credentials. Very often you're going to be pushing through different layers and running as either a service account or something else. These can land you in different roles, sometimes local accounts, sometimes domain accounts, or domain user, domain admin, different types of managed accounts. But generally, as we walk through these scenarios, you're going to be, this is kind of like how SQL Server is set up, right? We have the Windows operating system. SQL Server runs as a service in the background. Within that, you have a bunch of different user mappings, but when you execute commands on the operating system, most of the time it's going to be one of three scenarios. You're running as a service account, you're running as a Windows account that's been set up as a proxy, which we'll talk about briefly, or you're running as the SQL Server agent. There's a bunch of other services I haven't even dug into yet that are associated with SQL Server, but that's the gist for now. All the methods we'll be talking about boil down to some pretty basic command execution methods. We're going to be using .NET, we're going to be using C++, and we're going to be using COM objects via common scripting engines. So let's just get XP command shell out of the way really quick. It is just a C++ exported method that's mapped to an SQL Server stored procedure. That's all that is. It was a native method created by Microsoft. It can be executed by sysadmins by default, and you can also have a designated proxy account to run as a different domain user. I don't recommend doing either of those things. You can possibly help it. We do see some attackers. These are common attacker scripts, right? Reinstall. If it's been fully uninstalled, you can reinstall it from scratch. You can re-enable it on the server and run it. And so the questions I get from red teamers a lot is, are people watching for this stuff? I did also create a PowerUp SQL function for this as well, and it's been around for a while. So they're asking, can you see me? And about a quarter of the time, I'd say they are. If people are looking for OS command execution, they're looking explicitly for this most of the time. So somebody spent a day making this guy. This is just like the best crossover ever. Anyways, but from an attacker perspective, there's good news because there's lots of different ways to execute commands. I have a short list here. I'll kind of walk through them as we go through instead of right here, but this is probably just the tip of the iceberg. This is just the options that I started to discover over the last few years. So first, extended stored procedures. These are just going to be custom versions of XP command shell, right? It's just a C library with an exported function. In this case, I'm writing it. The neat thing is when you register it, You don't actually have to point to a .dll file. It can be a .txt, like a rename file, so that helps for a little bit of hiding yourself. And you can also load it via WebDev. We've done this in the lab using some proxy authentication stuff. We're trying to set up a PowerShell script to automate the entire process, so you could, in theory, reflectively load a custom extended store procedure. So that's a work in progress. General steps are compile your C++ DLL, register it. I have code examples for these out in the PowerUp SQL templates directory as well, so you can take them and run with them. Generally speaking, you get, I don't know if you guys can see it down here, but it's basically just your exported method, pretty straightforward. And then I just put in some basic examples of how to execute commands through C++. So you guys can run that at home. This is just a sheet of different ways to register it in SQL Server and run it. I have the highlighted one. This is my favorite, right? You're going to be basically registering your custom C++ DLL method from WebDAV. That's what this path looks like. And we're going to rename it TXT. So it can look pretty arbitrary coming through your proxies and stuff. But something to be aware of. I created two functions for this, one for creating custom DLL files that just execute your arbitrary command, and then also for just like scanning for custom stuff. So if you're looking for what your dev team's done or potentially malicious stuff, you can run those functions. The sexiness this year that everyone talked about a lot was CLR. So these are just .NET DLLs that you load into SQL Server to extend the kind of native functionality of SQL Server. Very similar to the C++ DLLs, you're just going to be mapping a function in .NET to a stored procedure in SQL Server, right? The difference is that it's just gonna run in the .NET runtime. Let's see here. There's a number of dependencies. Oh, real quick shout out. As I was doing development for this, Lee Christensen and Nathan Kirk put out a couple tool sets which are really awesome. So props to them for getting that out. It definitely saved me some time when I was putting things together. The downside to using CLR assemblies is it does, if they're not already enabled on the system, it really requires a ton of configuration changes which can set up flags everywhere. So it's incredibly flexible medium for command and other execution, but can be kind of loud and conspicuous. This is just another code example. I'm not going to go into it, but it's the same general idea. There's an exported function, more or less, and you're doing code execution. The really cool thing, so this is just kind of a registration example. One thing I didn't note here is that the best thing about CLR assemblies that people tend to like is instead of registering a DLL from a physical path, whether that's local, UNC, or WebDAV, you can actually convert your DLL to like a hexadecimal string, and you can use that string to register the CLR, which means you don't have to have it read from disk anywhere. So you can literally inject this in a normal SQL injection. Find a web app, escalating through SQL Server, you can load your custom DLL evil file onto the server, essentially. Another interesting thing we saw during pen tests is we tend to just select and see what custom assemblies are already there, made by developers. We're finding encrypted keys to decrypt data. We're finding passwords to other services that we can pivot through. So we created this set of functions in PowerUp SQL. We have the ability to create your own CLR. It randomizes all the class names and all that stuff, so it's harder to detect. We have one just for executing commands. It will build up and change all the configurations that are needed and restore state at the end. And then selecting stored procedures. The other thing we realized when we were looking at existing stored procedures is the DLL, when it's imported, is actually stored in its entirety in the database, which means we can export them back to their original DLLs. So I can go into a database, I can extract all the DLLs, and then I can start reverse engineering them or backdooring them, which is really cool. So we did a couple blogs on that, so check that out if you're interested. But in the interest of saving time, we'll keep moving. Only automation procedures. So this is basically the ability to execute on COM objects through SQL Server natively. It's been around since 2000. It's been in malware since SQL has been around. So this is probably one of the more common ones that people don't talk about a lot. But the darker community kind of is really, really aware of. So it's nice. You basically have to flip one bit on the configuration, and then away you go. You can execute commands. You can do WMI execution. Anything that COM can do, you can do. Here's a really quick example calling the wscript.shell. That's kind of like the standard that you're seeing with Casey Smith and Matt Nelson are kind of putting out a lot on lately. So these sample scripts that are also out on the directory on the GitHub will kind of just show you how to execute command, write to a file, read that output, and then display it through SQL Server. So the function that I have for this, you can kind of see it will reconfigure everything if it needs to, restore state, and then clean up after itself, etc. So it's kind of fun. As a bonus slide, Leary got me to kind of put this up. A lot of people really like PowerShell download cradles, right? Download your payload from the internet and run it. Everyone's super excited about that. Pretty much every method we have here can do that. So I'm just kind of highlighting the fact that with using the comms, we're putting together a HTTP request out to the internet. We're pulling down, this could be any URL. We're pulling down our command down here. This is just displaying it for the sake of the example and then executing it. So you could have it execute anything all the way down to the OS level. And it's pretty ambiguous. So it's kind of neat. So just keep that in mind as you're thinking about SQL Server as a platform for persistence. The other one that's got a lot of attention is agent jobs. So these are just scheduled tasks that exist on the SQL Server. Got a couple nods, okay. SQL Server layer. By default, sysadmin's going to run under the context of the service account of the agent. If you're running in a lower user context, you're probably running with one of these roles, and they require a proxy account. And that's where that other Windows account comes into play. The DBA will have to specify that usually. But there's a lot of different types of jobs. These are the top 5. We spend a lot of time analyzing these in large environments. These are the top 5 type of jobs. Top, I guess, 4 of the 5 can execute commands. So it's kind of hard. It's pretty easy to blend in, I should say, as an attacker when most of the stuff executing in the environment legitimately already falls into, these categories or these subsystems. One important note when you are running commands through agent jobs, the agent service has to be running. Not everybody has it on. But once you do that, you can create the job and configure it to self-delete. It's a recommendation, so then it can run in the background by itself and just clean up when it's done. Just make sure that that job's not going to exhaust all the memory of your production database server or everybody's losing their job. So just think about that. Here's another couple of, I have examples of about 3 or 4 subsystems I'm going to go over real quick. We have cmdshell, which does not use XP command shell. It's a completely different library. So when you're tracing that, it's going to be different, but it's verbatim, just Windows commands. PowerShell, I think it wraps the management automation system, management automation. I always mess up the language, but basically the PowerShell library. And then so you can just pass these in and it creates a run space for it. JScript, which you've been seeing from Casey Smith and the other guys quite a bit. So we're literally going to be doing the COM object calls, right, for shell execute, shell application with shell execute, and passing in whatever we want. Same with VB script, right? So we have all these different types. We have a lot of variability. And like I said before, with COM objects, it's pretty well known. Everyone chats about it. Like you can do full WMI, other subsystems on the window. You saw earlier, you can do full HTTP request response. You can connect to LDAP. So literally, you can do anything. So this is just like the simplest thing you could possibly be doing. If you really are getting interested in it, there's two nice tools. There's OliCom Object Viewer, which has been around for Microsoft for years, and this one came out a couple of years ago, I think. The oliview.net. I can't remember the author. Was that Fauché? Okay, never mind. Anyways, check them out. The URL's down at the bottom for those who are interested. Similar to the other things, coming in as an attacker post-exploitation, just listing the jobs. This is just an example of jobs I created. You can actually go through and view the source code for those jobs, and we find decryption keys, and we find passwords, and we find methods for pivoting, and all kinds of stuff. So it's not always just persistence. It's not always command execution. Sometimes it's about privilege escalation. So just keep that in the back of your mind. We did create this Get SQL agent. It can run and give you a list of all the jobs and that information. Also, if you run it on scale in a domain context, you can get a lot more information, but this was a smaller sample domain. But you can get a breakdown of how many jobs are across your entire environment, how many instances, what the job types are, and things like that. So it's nice when you're doing profiling in a target environment. Also, big thanks to Leo Lubig, who put together the agent command execution for PowerUp SQL. Because of him, we have basically these methods here to do command execution using PowerUp SQL through agent jobs. So that was pretty neat. Next, Microsoft is really trying to start to compete kind of in the machine learning space, right? They want to do big data analytics, and to support that, they've introduced 2 runtimes over the course of the last 3 years. One is R, and one is Python. So they're completely different runtimes that have to be installed with SQL Server, so they're not always around. The other downside is that although both of those can be used to execute commands, if they're installed but not enabled, you can enable them as attacker, but it requires restarting the service. Once again, a normal person isn't going to restart a production SQL server. So there's some pretty big constraints there that makes them not very useful, at least at this point from an attacker perspective, but for due diligence, I wanted to make sure I was covering them. All right, there's a couple commands for those too. That's what it looks like, I think. All right. File autoruns are also really neat. So just short summary for those who aren't familiar. Basically, you drop a file on the disk somewhere, and then it executes after a certain action, like user logs in, system restarts, service restarts, whatever. So there's a couple different methods I have here. One is, there's a number of providers in SQL Server that allow you to connect to LDAP, to files on the systems, to Excel documents, to Access documents, all kinds of different things. I'm not going to go too hardcore into those. The one that I wanted to focus on today briefly was the bulk insert file copy, which is kind of a novel technique that was discovered by Auntie. It's one of our app guys. So let's see here if I'm going to get this right. So historically, people use bulk insert to read files from the disk. It's a pretty common, well-known method for both attackers and legitimate use. What Auntie was playing with and figured out is that it also has some extended error handling functionality. So what you can do is create a temp table, which you would normally, put the data into after reading a file. You basically set it up to be an integer or int, and then you can read your file from a UNC path, local path, webdev path, right? It's going to suck that down. That's essentially going to be some type of varchar, whatever, some type of ASCII string thing. It's going to try to put that into this field, and it's going to get a casting error. So we're forcing an error. And with the extended functionality of bulk insert, what it will do is it will take this source file content and it will place it anywhere on disk for you. So I can literally set the path and the name of the file with the extension and drop it anywhere on the disk. So it's a really cool way to copy files down from the internet to your target, but it's also kind of amplified when you're using it for auto-run execution on the OS level. So props to him for that. Very cool. All right, so that was a lot of stuff really fast. I acknowledge that. I did create some cheat sheets. I'm not going to go over them in their entirety, but technique, function, and then the TSQL template file that's out on GitHub. Trying to save some time for people. This is a breakdown of requirements for the different for the different techniques. Not going to go into that either, but offline cheat sheet for those who want to use it. Make your eyes bleed a little bit. And in future research, like I said, there's all these cool providers in SQL Server. I've only looked at like 2 of them. There's probably 5 more natively, and I'm pretty sure you can add your own. So there might be some really cool potential in the future here. And then with all the audit functionality, scanning and stuff, my goal is to have one command execution function, basically scans your privileges, scans the audit configuration, chooses the best option for command execution, and then runs it for you so you don't have to go through that all manually. So that will come down the line as well. Probably do a blog before next year. So, all right, with that, I'm going to hand it over to Leary.
So kind of short on time, so we're going to fly through this. Over the past year, we've written a bunch of PowerShell Empire modules. What just happened?
You unplugged them down there.
Who let me know the computer? Whoa. All right. Who let me know the computer? All right.
F5.
F5.
Escape. F5. Shift F5.
Shift F5. What is going on?
I'm gonna have a seizure. This is probably the worst way to get there, I acknowledge that. What if I just hold it down? Is this gonna work? Yeah. It's way easier. Bear with us. We're gonna get there, I promise. Eventually.
All right, here we are. All right. Over the past year, we've written a bunch of PowerShell Empire modules for PowerUp SQL. Just a brief overview of those. Yeah, more Empire. So we wrote the Get SQL Instance Domain, which is an Empire module to find SQL servers. The Get SQL Server Info, which will pull down basic information about the SQL server. Most importantly there, in the context of Empire, whether or not you're a sysadmin. And then Get SQL Default Login Password, which will check for default logins that we found over the years. Get SQL Query, which will just run a simple query. Get SQL Column Sample Data, which will start pulling in down sample data from all the SQL servers that we specify. This is really useful for us when we're doing, say, a PCI engagement. We're looking for plaintext credit card data. And then invoke SQL OS command, which is the one everyone wants. That one just launches XP command shell command through Empire. There's your basic output of running Who Am I. We also put in the capability just natively just to generate an Empire stager and run that, so that we can just skip that. Today we've come up with a bunch of new techniques. Many of these we ported over. We'd like to get some feedback about what you're interested in seeing be ported over to Empire, and we'll start working on that in the next coming weeks. All right, back to you.
Sure. I realize we're like 2 minutes down already, so I'm going to just really cut through this. So for the blue teamers, short of all the fun little graphics, this is a little light instruction guide for auditing for the command execution techniques that we talked about today. It's going to walk you through how to create the audit, the server configuration, and the database level configuration for the commands that you don't run up very often, right? And you're pretty much only running if you're registering a DLL or you're executing OS commands. I also have the event IDs for most of the configuration changes and most of the command execution. So that should be handy for sim cheat sheets, etc. And with that, I'll give it to Leary, and we'll wrap it up.
Sure.
Super fast.
Okay. So takeaway number one is, just because you're logging on XP command shell doesn't mean you can catch all command execution options. As we've seen, there's a ton of them. Also, SQL Server can be a beachhead to avoid detection. Traversing and doing lateral movement via SQL servers has been our go-to method for the past couple of years. It still works because nobody audits on it. Please start auditing on those. And then, we've simplified this out and lowered the bar by and the barrier to entry by porting it over to Empire, which simplifies things immensely. And then, just remember, blue teamers, everything we've covered today can be logged in some way, shape, or form. You just have to do it. So, questions?
Sorry. Well, thanks everybody for coming.
Yep. Thank you.
Oh yeah. Also, if anybody wants a monkey sticker, or we have these little bottle opener things, hit us out. We'll be outside the door. Give these to you.
Yep.